The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a utility bill and a catalog for cowboy boots Clint hadn't ordered, but somehow kept receiving every spring. It was thick, cream-colored, sealed with a wax stamp that bore the logo of a late-night talk show he'd heard about but never watched. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of it, not just paper but expectation. At 93, most invitations he got were for retrospectives, tributes, or quiet dinners with old friends who, like him, preferred silence to small talk. This one felt different. He opened it with a letter opener carved from mesquite wood, a gift from a ranch hand decades ago. Inside was a handwritten note from the show's producer, polite but persistent, explaining that the host, a sharp, fast-talking interviewer known for cutting through celebrity fluff, wanted to speak with him not about movies, but about something deeper, the principles that had guided him through 9 decades of American life. They weren't asking for nostalgia. They wanted to understand how a man like him, who'd lived through war, social upheaval, technological revolutions, and Hollywood's many reinventions, still stood by certain ideas even when the world seemed to have moved on. Clint read the letter twice. Then he set it on his kitchen table, poured himself a cup of black coffee, and walked out to the porch. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant rain. His ranch in Carmel stretched out before him. Rolling hills, oak trees, the quiet rhythm of horses moving in the distance. This was where he thought best. Not in boardrooms or green rooms, but here, where the only audience was the wind. His team had already voiced their concerns. "That show's gotten edgy lately," his manager had said over the phone. "They don't just ask questions, they test people. Last week, they had that tech CEO on the spot about data privacy until he walked off set." Another assistant added, "It's not really your style, is it? You've never been one for public debates," and that was true. Clint had spent a lifetime avoiding the spotlight when it wasn't necessary. He directed films not to win awards, but because he believed in telling stories that showed people as they really were. Flawed, stubborn, sometimes heroic in small, unnoticed ways. He'd served as mayor of Carmel not for power, but because someone needed to fix the potholes and keep the town from selling its soul to developers. He didn't tweet, didn't give interviews unless he had something real to say, and never played the game of outrage that seemed to fuel so much of modern conversation. But this invitation, it tugged at something. Maybe it was the way the producer had written, "We're not looking for a performance. We're looking for truth." Or maybe it was the quiet frustration he'd felt lately, watching public discourse shrink into slogans and sound bites, where nuance was treated like weakness and conviction was mistaken for arrogance. He'd seen real courage, on battlefields, in hospitals, in ordinary people working 2 jobs to feed their kids, and it rarely made headlines. By late afternoon, he called his manager back. "Tell them I'll do it," he said. "But only if they understand I won't be baited. I'm not there to defend a brand or a party. I'm there as a man who's lived long enough to know what matters." The response came quickly. The host was thrilled. Rehearsals? None needed. Teleprompters? He could ignore them. They'd keep it raw, just 2 people talking. That was fine with Clint. He'd never needed scripts for the hard conversations. In the days leading up to the taping, he didn't prepare talking points. Instead, he sorted through old photographs. Him as a young lifeguard in Oakland, standing tall in his uniform. On the set of Rawhide, sunburned and grinning. Shaking hands with veterans at a USO event long after the cameras had left. These weren't memories for show. They were reminders of who he'd been, and who he still was beneath the fame. He also thought about his father, a hard-working man who'd struggled through the Depression, who taught him that your word was your bond, and that showing up mattered more than talking big, and his mother, who'd worked nights so he could take piano lessons, who believed kindness didn't need an audience. Those lessons hadn't come from books or speeches. They'd been lived day after day in choices no one saw but the people they affected. The night before the flight to Los Angeles, he sat on the porch again, this time with a blanket over his shoulders. The stars were bright, undimmed by city lights. He felt calm, not nervous. Not because he expected to win anything, but because he wasn't going there to win. He was going to speak plainly the way he always had, with respect but without pretense. When he arrived at the studio the next evening, the energy was electric. Cameras rolled constantly, assistants darted between monitors, and the audience buzzed with excitement. They'd come expecting stories about Dirty Harry or Unforgiven, maybe a few jokes about old Hollywood. What they didn't know was that the man walking onto that stage carried something quieter, but far more enduring. A lifetime of watching what happens when people choose principle over popularity. Backstage, the host greeted him warmly, firm handshake, direct eye contact. "Thanks for doing this," he said. "I know it's not your usual thing." Clint nodded. "Just promise me one thing," he replied. "If I say something you don't like, don't pretend to agree. Ask me why. That's all I ask." The host smiled, but there was a flicker in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe caution. He'd interviewed generals, activists, billionaires. But this was different. This wasn't a persona. This was a man who'd shaped his own path without asking for permission or applause. As Clint stepped onto the set, the lights warmed his face. The audience rose to their feet, clapping not out of habit but genuine respect. He gave a small wave, then sat down. No fanfare, no grand entrance. Just a man in a well-worn blazer ready to talk. What he didn't know yet was that this conversation would become something far bigger than either of them expected. That a single question, framed as a challenge, would unlock a moment so raw, so human, that it would leave the room frozen not in shock, but in silence. The kind of silence that comes when truth cuts through noise, but that was still ahead. For now there was just the chair, the camera, and the simple act of showing up, exactly as he was. The studio lights felt warmer than Clint expected, not harsh but steady, like late afternoon sun through a window. He settled into the chair, its leather soft from years of guests who'd sat there hoping to be seen, heard, or remembered. The audience was still applauding, but he didn't let it pull him off center. He'd been in front of crowds before, on movie sets, at town meetings, even once at a rodeo in Nevada where he'd been asked to say a few words after a local rancher's funeral. He knew the difference between noise and connection. This room had noise. Whether it would find connection was still unwritten. The host took his seat across from him, smiling easily. The kind of smile that said he'd done this 1,000 times and knew exactly how to steer a conversation. "Most people your age are relaxing on a porch somewhere," he began, voice light, almost teasing. "You're still directing films, still showing up. What keeps you going?" Clint leaned back slightly, hands resting on his knees. "I guess I never saw life as something you retire from," he said. "Work isn't just about money. It's about purpose. If you've got something to say or something to fix, you keep at it." The audience chuckled softly. It was a safe answer, warm and familiar. The host nodded as if filing that away, then shifted almost imperceptibly. His next question came smoother, wrapped in admiration but edged with something sharper. "You've always marched to your own drum. Refused studio interference, turned down big paychecks, even ran for mayor just to protect your town. People call that independence. Others might call it stubbornness. Where do you draw the line between standing your ground and shutting people out?" Clint didn't flinch. He'd heard versions of this before. In interviews, in whispers after speeches, even in letters from strangers who thought his views didn't fit neatly into today's boxes. "Independence isn't about shutting people out," he said slowly. "It's about not letting the noise decide who you are. I've worked with hundreds of people over the years, actors, crew, neighbors. I listen, but I also know what I believe. And I won't pretend otherwise just to be liked." A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Not disapproval, more like surprise. They'd expected charm, maybe a folksy anecdote. Instead, they were getting honesty, plain and unvarnished. The host leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "That brings me to something you've said before, about personal responsibility. You once said, 'Don't blame the world for your problems. Fix what you can.' That sounds noble. But a lot of people today would say that ignores systemic issues, racism, inequality, the cost of living. Do you really think telling someone to just work harder helps when the deck is stacked against them?" The room tightened. You could feel it, the shift from curiosity to tension. Cameras zoomed in. Even the stagehands seemed to pause. This wasn't just a question about philosophy. It was a test. Clint took a breath. He looked not at the host, but past him, toward the darkened wings of the stage, as if gathering his thoughts from somewhere deeper than memory. "I never said just work harder," he replied, voice steady. "What I said was, don't wait for someone else to save you. There's a difference." He paused, then continued. "I grew up poor. My dad lost jobs more times than I can count. We didn't have much, but we had each other. And we had pride. Not the kind that looks down on others, but the kind that says, I'll do my part even if it's small. That doesn't mean the world's fair. It never has been. But giving up your agency? That's the real trap. Because once you believe you have no power, you stop trying. And then nothing changes, not for you, not for anyone. The host nodded slowly, but his eyes stayed sharp. But isn't there a danger in that mindset? Like if everyone just focuses on themselves, who's looking out for the community? For justice? Looking out for your community starts with showing up as someone others can count on, Clint said. Not posting about it, doing it. I've seen people help neighbors after fires, give rides to folks without cars, take in kids whose parents couldn't care for them. No cameras, no credit, just decency. That's the kind of responsibility I mean. It's not selfish, it's the opposite. It's saying, I won't add to the problem. I'll be part of the solution however I can. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes quickly. A man near the back sat up straighter. The host glanced at his notes, then set them aside. You've also been critical of what some call cancel culture, he said, choosing his words carefully. You've said it feels more like punishment than progress. Do you really think calling out harmful behavior is wrong? I didn't say that, Clint corrected gently. Calling out harm? That's necessary. But turning it into public shaming where one mistake defines a person forever, that's not justice. That's fear. Real change comes from understanding, not humiliation. I've made plenty of mistakes in my life. If I'd been judged only by my worst moment, I wouldn't be sitting here. The audience was completely still now. No laughter, no shifting in seats. Just listening. The host exhaled almost imperceptibly. He'd come in with a script in his mind. Push the old icon, expose the contradictions, get a viral clip. But Clint wasn't playing the role he'd assigned him. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't angry. He was just present, human, and that was harder to box in. So what do you say, the host asked, his voice quieter now. To young people who feel like the values you talk about, self-reliance, quiet dignity, minding your own business, don't work in a world that's loud, connected, and constantly demanding you pick a side. Clint looked down for a moment, then back up, his eyes clear. I'd say the world's always been loud. It's just louder now. But the quiet things still matter. Helping without being asked. Keeping your word. Treating people with respect even when you disagree. Those aren't old-fashioned. They're timeless. And they're harder to practice when everyone's watching, which is exactly why they matter more now than ever. The host didn't respond right away. He just looked at Clint, really looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. Not as a legend, not as a symbol, but as a man who'd lived long enough to know that the simplest truths are often the hardest to hold on to. And in that silence, something shifted. Not just in the conversation, but in the room itself. The energy wasn't combative anymore. It was curious, open, like everyone had leaned in at once, waiting to hear what came next. Not because it would be dramatic, but because it might be true. Clint didn't know it yet. But the real question, the one that would freeze the room, was still coming. But for now, he'd done what he came to do. Speak plainly, without armor, without agenda. Just a man sharing what he'd learned, hoping someone might find it useful. And in a world full of noise, that was already rare enough to stop people in their tracks. The air in the studio had changed. It wasn't just quieter, it was heavier, like the room itself was holding its breath. The host sat back for a moment, fingers tapping lightly on his knee as if weighing something he hadn't expected to find. He'd come into this interview with a plan. Challenge the myth, poke at the contradictions, maybe walk away with a headline. But Clint wasn't a myth. He was flesh and bone, memory and regret, and he spoke like someone who'd learned the hard way that words matter. Not for how they sound, but for what they cost. After a pause that felt longer than it was, the host leaned in again, but this time his voice dropped, losing its performative edge. You keep talking about responsibility, he said, about not blaming the world. But here's what I wonder. Do you really believe that's still possible? Or has personal responsibility been replaced by blame? And if it has that made us weaker as a people? The question landed like a stone in still water. No flourish, no trap hidden in clever phrasing, just a direct, almost painful honesty. And for the first time since he'd walked on stage, Clint didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands that had held guns in movies, Hammers on sets, reins on horseback, and the hands of friends saying goodbye. Hands that had aged like everything else but still worked. Still chose. He thought of the young man he'd been, working odd jobs to send money home, sleeping in his car between shifts, never once thinking the world owed him anything, only that he owed it his best shot. He thought of the veterans he'd met over the years, men and women who came back from war carrying wounds no one could see, yet still showed up for their families, their jobs, their communities without fanfare or complaint. He thought of the single mother who ran the diner near his ranch, up before dawn every day, never asking for pity, just doing what needed to be done. And then he thought of how rare that quiet strength seemed now. Not gone, but drowned out by a culture that rewarded outrage over effort, performance over perseverance. When he finally looked up, his eyes weren't angry. They were sad, not for himself, but for something he saw slipping away. "I don't think people have stopped being responsible," he said slowly. "I think we've just stopped honoring it." He paused, letting the words settle. Blame is easy. It's fast. You can point a finger and feel like you've done something. But responsibility? That's slow. It's hard. It means looking in the mirror first. It means admitting you don't have all the answers. It means showing up even when no one's clapping. A few people in the audience shifted, not out of discomfort but recognition. Someone in the back row nodded almost imperceptibly. "Take a kid who grows up in a tough neighborhood," Clint continued. "Yeah, the system might be stacked against him. But I've met kids like that who still study late, help their siblings, work part-time jobs. They don't wait for someone to fix their life. They start where they are. And when they do, something changes. Not just for them, but for everyone around them. That's not naive. That's courage." He leaned forward slightly, voice softening but gaining weight. "But if we tell that kid it's not your fault, so don't even try, we're stealing something from him. We're telling him he's powerless. And once you believe that, you stop fighting. You stop hoping. And that's when real damage happens, not from the hardship but from the surrender." The host was silent now, truly listening. The usual rhythm of the show, the quick cuts, the punchy follow-ups had vanished. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was something closer to witness. "And what about those in power?" the host asked after a moment. "Politicians, celebrities, influencers, they often shift blame constantly. Does that trickle down?" Clint gave a small, tired smile. "Of course it does. People watch, especially young people. If the adults won't own their mistakes, why should anyone else? But here's the thing. Real leadership isn't about never failing. It's about owning it when you do. I've messed up plenty. Hired the wrong person. Made a film that missed the mark. Said things I later regretted. But I never blamed the crew, the critics, or the weather. I looked at myself and asked, what can I do better next time? That's not pride. That's respect for the work and for the people counting on you." He glanced out at the audience, not performing, just connecting. "We've gotten so afraid of being wrong that we'd rather be angry than admit we don't know. But being wrong isn't weakness. Refusing to learn from it is." A long silence followed. Not awkward, deep. The kind that comes when people are thinking, not waiting to talk. Then from somewhere in the middle of the audience, a soft voice said, "Thank you." It wasn't loud, but everyone heard it. Clint nodded slightly, as if that single word meant more than a standing ovation. The host swallowed, then asked the question that had been building since the interview began, the one he'd rehearsed in his head a dozen different ways, but now felt too heavy for cleverness. "Do you think we've lost something essential as a country? Not politically, but in our character?" Clint didn't answer right away. He looked past the lights again, past the cameras, as if seeing something far off. Maybe it was the America he remembered. The one where neighbors checked on each other after storms, where a handshake meant something, where you judged a person by how they treated the waitress, not how many followers they had. "I don't think we've lost it," he said finally. "I think it's just buried under noise. But it's still there. In the nurse working double shifts. In the teacher buying supplies for her students. In the stranger who stops to help a car on the side of the road. Those people don't make headlines, but they're the ones holding us together." He turned back to the host, his voice quiet but firm. "Values aren't about being popular. They're about showing up when it costs you something, and that hasn't changed. It never will." At that moment, no one moved. No one reached for their phone. No one whispered to their neighbor. The entire room, crew, audience, even the host, was frozen. Not by shock, not by drama, but by the rare, unsettling power of truth spoken without agenda. And in that stillness, something passed between them. Not agreement, not even understanding, but a shared recognition that maybe, just maybe, the old ways weren't outdated. Maybe they were exactly what was missing. The host opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. For the first time in his career, he had no follow-up. Only silence, and sometimes silence is the loudest answer of all. The silence stretched, not empty but full, like the quiet after a storm when the world feels washed clean and everything matters a little more. The host sat still, fingers resting on his knees, his usual rhythm gone. He'd spent years mastering the art of the follow-up question, always ready with a pivot, a jab, a clever twist to keep things moving. But now, for the first time, he didn't want to interrupt. Not because he was stunned, but because something real had just happened. Something that couldn't be edited into a clip or reduced to a headline. Clint didn't fill the quiet with more words. He never had. He'd learned long ago that the most powerful things are often said in what you don't say, what you let hang in the air so others can feel it, not just hear it. He sat with his hands folded, calm, like a man who'd spent a lifetime listening to the spaces between words. Then, slowly, the host leaned forward again, but this time his voice was different, softer, less like an interviewer and more like someone asking for help. "You talk about showing up when it costs you," he said. "But how do you keep doing that when it feels like no one notices? When the world rewards the loudest voice, not the truest one?" It was a personal question, not a political one, and Clint heard that. "I don't do it for notice," he replied. "I do it because it's who I am. You don't plant a tree because you'll sit in its shade. Sometimes you do it because someone else will. That's enough." He glanced toward the audience, not to perform, but to connect. "I've known men who built houses they'd never live in. Women who raised kids that weren't theirs. People who gave what they didn't have to spare. They didn't wait for a spotlight. They just did what needed doing. And that's the thing. Character isn't built in front of cameras. It's built in the dark when no one's watching." A woman near the front wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. A young man in a crew t-shirt stood just off stage, arms crossed, but his eyes were fixed on Clint like he was hearing something he'd been waiting for his whole life. The host nodded slowly. "But doesn't it wear on you? Seeing people give up on that kind of quiet strength? Seeing kindness treated like weakness?" Clint's expression softened. "It hurts," he admitted. "But it doesn't surprise me. Life's always been hard. What's changed is how we talk about it. We used to say, 'Keep going.' Now we say, 'It's not your fault you stopped.' There's comfort in that, sure. But comfort doesn't build anything. It just keeps you where you are." He paused, then added, "I'm not saying the world's perfect. Far from it. But I've seen enough to know that hope isn't found in waiting for someone else to fix things. It's found in the next right thing you do, however small." The host looked down at his notes, then set them aside for good. "You've lived through wars, recessions, social movements, technological revolutions. What's the one thing that stayed the same?" Clint smiled faintly. "People. At the core, people haven't changed. We still want to be seen, to matter, to leave something behind that says, 'I was here and I tried.' The tools change, the phones, the politics, the noise, but the heart, that's the same." He leaned back slightly, his voice growing quieter but somehow carrying further. "I remember a kid I met once, maybe 10 years old, working at a gas station near Bakersfield. His dad had left, his mom was sick, and he was stocking shelves after school to help pay bills. I asked him if he was mad at the world. He looked at me like I was crazy and said, 'Nah, the world didn't do this, life did. And I'm still in it.' That kid had more wisdom than most adults I know." The audience was completely still. No coughs, no shuffling, no glances at phones. Just presence. "And that's what I keep coming back to," Clint continued. "We're all still in it. Messy, complicated, beautiful life. And the moment we forget that we have a role to play, not a perfect one, just an honest one, is the moment we start losing ourselves." The host exhaled, as if releasing something he'd been carrying. "So what do you say to someone watching this right now who feels tired? Who's tried to do the right thing but keeps getting knocked down?" Clint looked straight into the camera, not at the lens but past it, as if speaking directly to that person in their living room, their car, their late-night kitchen. "I'd say keep going," he said gently. "Not because it'll get easier, but because you're stronger than you think. And you're not alone. There are more people like you than you know, quiet, trying, showing up even when it hurts. You just don't see them because they're not shouting. He paused, then added, and don't confuse being quiet with being weak. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand still in a world that's spinning too fast. A few people in the audience nodded. One man closed his eyes for a second like he was holding on to those words. The host didn't ask another question. He just said thank you, and it sounded like he meant it, not as a host wrapping up a segment, but as a human being receiving a gift. The band, which usually swelled in at this point to signal a break, stayed silent. No one had given the cue. No one wanted to break the spell. And in that moment, something rare happened on live television. Nothing was performed. Nothing was exaggerated. There was no agenda, no spin, no attempt to go viral. Just two people, one old, one younger, talking about what it means to be human in a time that often forgets. As the camera held on Clint's face, lines etched by sun and time, the audience didn't applaud right away. They sat with what they'd heard. Because sometimes truth doesn't call for cheers. It calls for reflection. And in a world that rarely slows down, that pause, small, quiet, human, was its own kind of revolution. Backstage, a producer whispered to a colleague, "Did you get that?" The other just nodded, eyes still on the monitor. "Yeah, we got it." But they both knew this wasn't something you could package. It was something you carried with you. And for the first time in a long time, the room didn't feel like a studio. It felt like a place where something real had just been passed from one generation to the next. Not with fanfare, but with care. Clint didn't know it yet, but those words would echo far beyond that night. Not because they were clever, but because they were true. And truth, even when spoken softly, has a way of finding the people who need to hear it most. The clip spread quietly at first. No flashy thumbnails, no outrage bait. Just a raw, uncut segment shared between friends, teachers, veterans, and late-night scrollers who happened to pause mid-scroll. It wasn't the kind of video that exploded overnight. It grew like something planted, slowly, steadily, putting down roots in places algorithms couldn't reach. People didn't just watch it. They sent it to someone they cared about, often with a simple message, "This reminded me of you." Within days, high school classrooms played it during ethics discussions. A community center in Ohio used it as a prompt for a town hall on responsibility and resilience. A retired firefighter in Montana wrote a letter, not to a news outlet, but straight to Clint's ranch, saying the words had brought him to tears because they echoed what he'd tried to teach his own kids. That dignity isn't about never falling, but about how you rise when no one's watching. Back at his ranch, Clint heard none of this directly. He didn't check social media. He didn't read the think pieces dissecting his philosophy, or the hot takes arguing whether his views were outdated or refreshing. He was too busy. That week, he'd been fixing a broken gate on the north pasture, helping a neighbor move hay bales after a storm knocked down part of their barn, and reviewing a script about a small-town teacher who stayed in a failing school not for praise, but because the kids deserved better. These weren't grand gestures. They were just what needed doing. Still, life has a way of circling back. One afternoon, his assistant handed him a stack of letters, real paper letters, not emails, many with no return address, just heartfelt notes from strangers. One was from a young woman studying to be a nurse. She wrote that she'd been ready to quit after a grueling shift where nothing went right. But then she remembered Clint's line about planting trees you'll never sit under, and she stayed. Another came from a teenager who'd been bullied online and felt invisible, until he heard someone say that quiet strength still matters. "I didn't feel so alone after that," he wrote. Clint read each one slowly, folding them carefully when he was done. He didn't respond to most. He wasn't one for fanfare, but he kept them in a wooden box on his desk, next to old photos and a pocket knife his father gave him when he was 12. Meanwhile, the talk show host found himself changed too. In interviews afterward, he spoke less about getting reactions and more about listening deeply. He even canceled a planned segment that felt too performative, telling his team, "Let's leave space for truth, not just tension." Colleagues noticed he paused longer before jumping in, asked fewer leading questions, and seemed more interested in understanding than winning. None of this made headlines, but it mattered, because what happened that night on stage wasn't really about politics or generational divides. It was about something quieter and more essential. The human need to believe that how you live your life, day after ordinary day, actually counts. In a world obsessed with metrics, virality, and instant validation, Clint had offered something radical, the idea that integrity doesn't need an audience to be real, and people were hungry for that. Not everyone agreed with him, of course. Some critics called his views simplistic or out of touch, but even many of them admitted there was a sincerity in his words that was hard to dismiss. You couldn't accuse him of hypocrisy. He'd lived the same way off camera as on. That consistency, rare in public life, gave his message weight. Months later, at a film festival in Telluride, a young director approached him during a quiet moment between screenings. "I've been working on a story about a man who stays in his hometown after everyone else leaves," he said. "I was going to make him bitter, cynical, but after seeing that interview, I rewrote him. Made him kind, not because the world was kind to him, but because he chose to be." "Thank you for that," Clint just nodded. "Stories shape how we see ourselves," he said. "Choose wisely." That was the ripple no one predicted. Not a wave, but a series of small circles spreading outward, touching lives in ways no one could measure. A father used the interview to start a conversation with his son about what it means to be a man. Not tough, but trustworthy. A woman battling depression found comfort in the idea that showing up, even imperfectly, was enough. A group of volunteers in a food pantry printed a quote from the talk and taped it to their break room wall. "Don't wait for someone else to save you. Be someone others can count on." Back on his porch one evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the crickets began their nightly song, Clint sipped his coffee and watched the horses graze. He didn't think about legacy. He never had. Legacy wasn't something you built. It was something others carried forward when you were gone. What mattered was the work in front of you. The gate that needed mending. The hand that needed shaking. The truth that needed saying even if your voice shook. He'd never set out to freeze a room with his words. He'd only wanted to speak plainly, as he always had. But sometimes, in a world full of noise, plain truth is the most startling sound of all. And in that stillness, when the cameras stopped rolling, when the applause faded, when the internet moved on to the next thing, what remained wasn't a quote or a clip. It was a question quietly echoing in thousands of hearts. What kind of person do I want to be when no one's watching? That was the real impact. Not fame, not debate, but reflection. And for a man who'd spent a lifetime believing that actions speak louder than words, that was more than enough.